Privit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. Welcome. It's day 343. My name is Darren Gerdes. I do these daily updates on what's going on in Ukraine, but I don't just follow the battle map. I try to get to the um, headlines behind the headlines, like what's going on, what's driving what's going on. That's what I try to spend my time on. Today, I realized that everything that was in the headlines pointed to the Soviet roots of the Ukraine war, and that's what I want to talk about today. So here we go. We're going to talk about the battlefield and the information war and how that plays out. We'll talk about the U.S. is going to be delivering GLSDBs. Those are these longer range missiles or bombs, but they're not delivering jets. Rooting out corruption in Ukraine. We're going to understand the Hungarian Orban and the Czech leader Pavel. We'll talk about Vladimir Sorokin on the causes of the war, which is absolutely fascinating. And then we'll have some fun with Russian state media. So this is going to be big. So we're going to start with the British Ministry of Defense. It said in recent days, some of the most intense shelling in the conflict has taken place along the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine near Kherson city. Kherson remains the most constantly shelled large Ukrainian city outside of Donbas. However, commanders are likely partially aiming to degrade civilian morale, and that hasn't worked, but this is something that they think is going to work, and deter Ukraine counterattacks. That might be a little bit more probable in the shelling. Let's look at this article from Radio Free Europe. So, Ukrainian defenders under concentrated attacks in the east. Kyiv lobbies for warplanes. They said again, Russia has thrown a fresh contingent of troops at Ukrainian positions in the east, but failed to make notable advances. Now, I get messages from Russian trolls saying things like Bakhmut is encircled and they're, all these kinds of things. And it's really not. Let's look at the ISW. So here is the Institute for the Study of War. They talk about the introduction of Russia's conventional forces into Bakhmut's front lines has offset the culmination of Wagner Group's offensive and retained the initiative for Russian operations around the city. So they've replaced Wagner with actual Russian troops. The commander of a Ukrainian unit operating in Bakhmut confirmed that super qualified Russian conventional military troops are now reinforcing Wagner Group and private military company assault units in an ongoing effort to encircle Bakhmut. So they're trying to do that. You can see, if you look at the battle map, you can see them kind of working on either side of Bakhmut, but that they're encircled, it's not happened, at least not yet. Russian airborne troops are those troops that are being done. ISW does not forecast the imminent fall of Bakhmut to Russian forces, although the Ukrainian command may choose to withdraw rather than risk unacceptable losses. Unacceptable losses, tens of thousands of troops are around Bakhmut or in Bakhmut. Russian officials are again overestimating Russian military capabilities. Now, this is my first point that's going back to the Soviet era. Like the Soviet mindset, there's this hangover from the Soviet era that is still plaguing what's going on the ground right now. They're thinking like, we're this huge power. You're a fraction of what you were when you were the former Soviet Union, Russia. Like, you have to understand that. So you're not really this big bad thing that you think you were. Your landmass, pretty big. Your actual potential power to fight conventional warfare, not that impressive. Okay, Pushkin stated on January 31st that the Russian capture of Bakhmut will allow Russia to advance to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, theoretically, it does allow you to go behind, right, or go up and north. I get it, but you still have all this terrain to traverse that I don't know that this is going to actually work like you think it's going to. I mean, um, yeah, it's more theoretical than practical. Let me just put it like this. Pushkin has also claimed that Russian forces will seize Advika, but has not provided any explanation of how Russian forces will break through almost 9 years' worth of Ukrainian fortifications around the settlement. Now, put that in perspective, too. Since 2014, they've been defending, right? They've been preparing. So it's not as easy. Like, theoretically, it works. In practice, I don't think it will. The Russian Ministry of Defense may be attempting to fully supplant Wagner forces. Now, this was fascinating to my mind because, again, the infighting between the groups. Supplant Wagner forces near Bakhmut and frame the traditional Russian military command structures as a sole victor around Bakhmut, assuming that they actually take the city of Bakhmut. Um, again, the infighting, the silos, the one group playing off another. That's big. Prominent Russian mill bloggers continue to expose Russian military failures. Now, this kind of thing shouldn't happen in the Russians' calculation, like, hey, they should all be supporting this. We have laws supporting this. People have gone to jail for holding up blank signs that said nothing on it at a protest. So, prominent Russian mill blogger claimed on Russian state TV that Russian airborne forces lost 40 to 50% of their personnel between the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and September of 2022. Well, how about that? Okay, now the Kremlin is trying to remedy this. They have recently attempted to integrate some select mill bloggers, including this one, into its narrative control by offering them platforms on Russian state broadcasters while attempting to resurrect censorship efforts targeting the wider community. That goes right back to the Soviet time. That, like, what freedom? Like shredding the First Amendment. They have no problem with the equivalent of shredding the freedom that we take for granted in the West. Okay, let's keep going. This is an Al Jazeera article about the $2 billion package that is coming now, the next $2 billion package coming from the United States, but it's different, and it's important what the differences are. $2 billion worth of military aid for Ukraine that's expected to include longer range rockets. That's big part number one. And it's that's going to give a greater range. Now, big part number two is this: a portion of the package, expected to be 1.725 billion, would come from a fund known as Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, which allows President Biden's administration to get weapons from industry rather than U.S. weapon stock. So it's not just drawing on older equipment. You can actually purchase new stuff from industry, and that's potentially changing things, because maybe we don't want to give this particular thing, we don't want it to fall into Russian hands, or we don't want that, but we can go buy something new. This includes the purchase of a new weapon, the Ground-Launched Small Diameter Bomb, GLSDB, which has a range of 150 kilometers, double what they have range of before, which will push the Russian logistics back further. And it doesn't really, it really doesn't threaten Russia a whole lot, because you can only go but so far into Russian territory, but it does push the logistics back even further, and it's not quite the same as the 300-kilometer or 185-mile range of ATACMS, but it still doubles the capacity of HIMARS, and this is going to make a big, big dent. Okay, let's look at the next article. This is from The Guardian. So there is, we wanted jets. That we're not. It doesn't look like we're going to get jets. Germany's vice chancellor has spoken out against his country delivering fighter jets to Ukraine, saying such a move would probably be a step too far for Western allies. His name is Robert Habeck. He's, echoing what Schultz has said. However, there's a difference between battle tanks and fighter jets. Well, you weren't going to give battle tanks, and then you were kind of like, okay, we'll do it if the U.S. does it. Now, part of what's going on here, I understand, and I please correct me if I'm wrong. After World War II, the Brits and the Americans rewrote the rule book for what Germany could and couldn't do politically or militarily. And so the path to high command in Germany, for example, is through the bureaucracy. And that's different than the path to high command in the United States. Is you have to be like infantry or some other kind of combat arms in order to get to the highest echelons. And so it kind of tempered the very warlike, at least in the 20th century, German way of doing things, and made it a little bit more pacifist. And that was intentional. That was to try to like tamp some of that down. We didn't want World War III starting in Germany, right? And so, ideas have consequences. There's a cause and effect here. And so they're very cautious to go down this path. And I get that. I understand that. I'm not condemning that. I'm just trying to explain it. But at the same time, just don't interfere if others are trying to provide these weapons. Okay, let's turn our corner to a different topic entirely. Corruption. There's a hangover and corruption from the Soviet era as well. Now, the Russians like to explain this away like, no, this is the fault of capitalism when the oligarchs rose. No, the oligarchs are just the corrupt inheritors of the corrupt Soviet system, who the people that were in charge, well, were all equal, but some were more equal than others. Yeah, it was just the same thing in a different system, but it came from this previous system. Okay, so I'm belaboring that, but so there's corruption both in Russia and there's corruption in Ukraine, which was part of that Soviet system. Kolominsky's house. Now, Kolominsky was a Ukrainian oligarch, and he was actually somewhat tied to Zelensky. He was a TV producer and executive and whatever, and he helped in Zelensky's rise. Now, that does not mean that Zelensky is somehow tarred by that. He had to work with somebody in TV, and he did, and Kolominsky was one of these people. So they had investigations on him, searched his house, $40 billion worth of customs payment evasions. Investigative measures are being taken. Let's look at a Radio Free Europe ad about the same thing with corruption with him. And the corruption is big here, right? Ukraine raids home of Kolominsky. It was established that illegal mechanisms were combined with tax evasions and legalizations of funds obtained through criminal means. A little bit further, Kolominsky, one of Ukraine's richest men, is a former ally of Zelensky and owner of one of the country's most influential TV stations. He backed Zelensky's election campaign in 2019, but last year he was deprived of Ukrainian citizenship by Zelensky. Zelensky has to tamp down on this. He doesn't really have a choice on this. If he doesn't do this, he can lose Western partners who are saying, like, why are we giving you money when it's just going into corruption? And you can't do that. He can't allow that. Okay. And Zelensky ran as a reformer anyway. I mean, this was in his bones of what he wanted to do. Okay, State Security Service of Ukraine has exposed the ex-head of the Department of the Ministry of Defense of embezzling more than 100 million in hryvnia. So that's a lot less than that. It's like 1 to 37 or something like that in hryvnia to US dollar to hryvnia. So it's a lot less, but there's still millions, right? The SBU said, now this is the real misery of this. The head of the Department of the Ministry of Defense embezzling. That's not the problem. This is the problem. Well, I mean, that's a problem. It is a problem. Corruption's a problem. But this is really evil. The official purchased almost 3,000 bulletproof vests for the armed forces of Ukraine for more than 100 million. However, according to several independent examinations, these products do not meet requirements of Class 4 body armor and do not properly protect Ukrainian soldiers. Now, that's just evil. That's corruption being compounded into actually costing people's lives. And like this guy's trying to line his own pockets at the expense of the death of millions of his, well, not millions, but potentially hundreds of his countrymen, thousands maybe even of his countrymen, and because he's being shady. Evil. Okay. But again, it's a carryover from the previous system, right? Head of the Soviet Servant of the People parliamentary faction, David Arkema, announced the dismissal of the entire leadership of the State Customs Service of Ukraine. Wow. Okay. And the hits keep coming. Here we have foreign. Now, by the way, this guy was cleared. Foreign Minister of Internal Affairs, Arsen Akov. He died in a helicopter crash a little while ago. They did his search on him. Nothing was found on him. He was clean. But again, Zelensky has to take some actions. He announced new personnel measures. Those in the system who do not meet the fundamental requirements of the government and society should not stay at their posts. So I was arguing with somebody who wanted to, there's a Russian troll that wanted to say in the comments, well, when are the trials? See, Ukraine's just corrupt. There is corruption, but they're rooting it out. So they're trying to root it out at least. So where are the trials? Show me the trials. Okay, they got other fish to fry right now, but they are removing people from office who are suspected of corruption. They're doing that right now. So trials may come down the line, but right now they're taking steps, and that's what's really important here. And I think that's important to understand. Puts Zelensky in a real bind. It's a real unforced error when you have this kind of thing going on top of the war. And very importantly, we are preparing new reforms in Ukraine. Now, he's about to meet with the EU representatives trying to get into the EU, and rooting out this corruption is important to joining the EU. And that's going to be very important for Ukraine's survival and health long term. Reforms that will change the social, legal, and political reality in many ways, making it more human, transparent, and effective. A little bit further down, talking about the corruption. And one more thing, now that there's a certain lull with personnel decisions, but this does not mean that all the necessary steps have been taken. There will be decisions. Those in the system who do not meet the fundamental requirements of the state and the society should not linger in their chairs. That's right. They shouldn't be in those places if they're going to be acting in that way. Okay, let's turn our attention to something else. This is Viktor Orban. Orban is the president of Hungary, and he loves siding with Putin for some reason that it's hard to understand. Actually, it's not so much that, it's a he's he likes getting the West and getting whatever kind of deals he can get from Putin. So here's Russia, says Orban, um, has already succeeded in making Ukraine an ungovernable wreck. He told an audience just last week. It's Afghanistan now, Orban said. Vladimir Putin will not lose, and time is on Russia's side, he argued, calling Ukraine the land of nobody. Okay, so he's not a big fan of Ukraine, but it's not just that he's anti-Ukraine. There's something more to this puzzle, and I think they answer it here. Experts say Orban is not anti-Ukrainian. His rhetoric, and he sounds anti-Ukrainian by what he just said, the land of nobody, right? I don't like the guy. I think he's off base in many ways. But here, understand this. His rhetoric is simply an effort to play both sides and win political points at home. Now, remember, if you're thinking about what do politicians want most, they don't necessarily most want to help Ukraine. They want to stay elected in their own country. And so he's trying to talk to his own audience, and he's trying to make deals with Russia and stay in NATO. And he's getting all the benefits from this side and all the benefits from that side. It's kind of like the Turkish president, Erdogan. Erdogan is doing somewhat of the same thing, but he's just doing it a little bit more nimbly. The prime minister has spent years implementing a dual foreign policy, enjoying the benefits of EU and NATO memberships while developing lucrative relations with Moscow. Look, I mean, to some degree, the Germans were doing that as well. The Germans were primary in Europe and primary in NATO. They're a big, a looming figure, but they had that oil deal and gas deal with Russia, which they want to resurrect on the other side, or some do want to resurrect on the other side, and that could be clouding the way that they see things to some degree. So, but the Germans aren't doing it to the same degree as this guy, right? I mean, they're very light compared to this guy. This guy is in full rhetoric, trying to take to Ukraine's a nobody, right? Okay, on the other side we have this guy, and he's the president-elect, a Chechen leader. His name is Peter Pavel, and he said that he's a retired NATO general, and he said Ukraine would be morally and practically ready to join Western alliance once the conflict is ended. So that's the caveat. NATO can't allow Ukraine into NATO while there's actually a contested space on their territory. They would have to cut off that territory and say that's no longer us, that's Russia, and then join NATO if they wanted to join right now. And that's not going to happen. The Czech Republic was the first Western country to send tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, Soviet-designed T-72s, to Kiev. Right? I mean, they were right there with them. They remember what it's like to be Soviet or under Soviet domination. And once it was over, he told the BBC, this is part of the interview, and once it's over, he told the BBC he could see a clear place for Ukraine in NATO. The Ukrainian military will be probably the most experienced military in Europe. Yeah, that's true. Ukraine deserves to be part of a community of democratic countries. Absolutely true. Including NATO, they asked. Yes, I believe it. They really deserve it. They really do deserve it. And the only reason that this war is happening right now is because they're not part of NATO already. If they were part of NATO, this never would have happened. And that's just a sad reality. Because Putin is still in this hangover of the Soviet era, of Soviet system, thinking that they're much bigger and much greater and much more, and they have to keep Ukraine in their orbit. And they try to do this by peaceful means, going back to 2004, and with the deal that they were trying to draw Ukraine back into their orbit. Don't go to the EU. Come take our deal, and that didn't work. And then it's just degraded from there. So that's really where we are. Okay. Now this interview with Vladimir Sorokin is absolutely fascinating to understanding the Soviet mentality that still exists in Russia. I'm not an expert in this. I found this absolutely fascinating. If you want to understand more about this, please go out and watch everything that Vlad Vexler has done. He is masterful at this particular topic. Okay, so he talks about how at one point in here, he's talking about, so this guy had his books burned in Russia. So that's probably a sign that you can tell where he stands with things, right? He talked about how, Putin was a KGB agent. And I mean, he imbibed that KGB kind of vibe and hates the West. Now, with that being said, let's go on. So Radio Free Europe asks him, you once said that the corpse of the Soviet world was not burned in the 90s, but rather continued to rot in the corner all these years. Now that corpse has stood up and started killing. How is all that possible? What kind of creature is this? Now, I remember the 90s. I'm old enough to remember what happened. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were rejoicing, going, yes, okay, now maybe Russia can become a democracy and take its place rightfully in the world as a real power, not a militaristic power, but a real, like a trading partner and a real, right? And it didn't work out. The oligarchs took over. There was corruption from the previous system that just transferred to the capitalist system, and it's not really capitalist if it's oligarchs, right? That's a pseudo-capitalism, a fake capitalism where they're still, it's like a criminal enterprise when they're taking things for pennies on the dollar from the state. At any rate, so what actually emerged, he said, was a zombie. And as zombies do, it came back to life, but not as a human. That's a really good explanation of what was going on. He said, we didn't manage to bury this power pyramid of Ivan the Terrible back in the 1990s. Right. So the same czarist kind of, and some of you put this in the comments, like Tsar Putin does this or that, right? There's something really true about that. Okay, that same very heavy-handed authoritarian way of operating still exists even today. We didn't manage to bury this power pyramid of Ivan the Terrible back in the 1990s. It just took on a new facade and remained standing. But, as in the 16th century, there is one ruler at the top, exercising total power, and below him there are the operichniki, the total police force created by Ivan the Terrible, and innumerable loyal serfs, right? So that's how it works in Russia even today. It wasn't like in Germany in the late 1940s or in Czechoslovakia in the 1990s. We didn't have a Václav Havel, unfortunately. That was their leader in Czechoslovakia. And Germany suffered the complete military defeat, and the victors decided everything. That's right. The victors went and buried the Nazis and said, no, this will not happen. This is the end of it. They dug a grave for the corpse of Nazism, and German anti-fascists threw it in, right? So, yeah, so that's the difference between what happened there. Putin really wants to resurrect the old glory, and he needs Belarus, and he needs Ukraine, and he probably needs those former Soviet states to stay in league with him, but they're kind of drifting away from him. Like, I don't know if I want any part of this. Okay, a little bit further down, one Ukrainian intellectual, this is Radio Free Europe asking him, making the statement, one Ukrainian intellectual who grew up in Russian literature told me that he threw everything, including these writers that I'm not familiar with, into the trash on February 24th. He wanted to break his last link to the Russian world. To me, the saddest thing is that we can't blame him. That's right, and I've seen this before. The polls in Ukraine that were once in double digits in the East in support of Russia are now at like 2%, and people there's generational hatred between Ukraine and Russia right now. Sorokin said, yes, we can't, because he's right. That's right, they can't blame him. I mean, how would you experience this if this was what happened to your family, right? I mean, if the Russians had just destroyed your own people, I mean, yeah. So this was a really eye-opening interview. Okay, let's have some fun with Russian state media. And there's only 2 articles that I'm going to cover here. Kyiv-controlled city faces encirclement, says an official. This is the kind of Kool-Aid that these Russian trolls are drinking, that they're then telling me, well, Bakhmut's almost encircled. I'm not seeing it yet. You saw the ISW. The ISW is usually right on point. And then this one made me laugh. Russian oil price cap countermeasure comes into force. Okay, so what happened here is that, like, the way that OPEC works, it's a cartel, and they set the prices, and they won't sell it for anything other than that price. Well, the West tried to create its own anti-cartel or opposite cartel, like buyer's cartel, where we're going to set a price cap. We're not going to buy for anything more than that. Okay, so Russia, now to counteract that, says it has banned the sale of crude oil to parties that implement the West's price ceiling mechanism. Okay, and that sounds like a good move. And all other things being equal, it would be a good move. Look, if you want to sell me this Quest bar, this is a protein bar, and I want to buy it, but I won't buy it for, you want to sell it to me for $2, but I won't buy it for more than $1. You can just decide, yeah, I'm not going to sell it to you and walk away. And that's what the Russians are doing, except there's a problem here, and that is that a third of, or more than a third of their revenue comes from the sale of gas and oil, and that's like their state budget. Now they're trying to fund a war and they have to sell this stuff. And so where are they going to sell it? They're going to sell, how much more can you really sell to India after all, right? I mean, at a certain point, their coffers are full, right? Like India can't take any more. Where else are you going to sell it? So it's I don't think that this is really a solution, but I mean, this is just the way that they're saying, see, we don't need you. We're going to do it on our own. No, you have to sell your oil. You're petro dependent. John McCain said that you're a gas station masquerading as a state, and there's some truth to that. I think there's something about right. Okay, that's all that I have today. Thank you for your time. If you appreciated what we talked about today, like, share, subscribe. I really appreciate it if you would spread the word here. Thank you for those of you who have like mentioned me to other YouTubers. I appreciate it because some of them like have then contacted me or suggested that we talk or whatever else. And we're a very small community, and we all want the same thing. If you want to support me, you can buy me a cup of coffee. I appreciate the few of you that have done that. And if you want to support a good cause, go to legitimate charities. Support things like United 24 or Samaritan's Purse. The links are below for that. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine, and I'll see you tomorrow.